That's better. A nice cosy cup of tea. Oh, hello. My name's Jonas. I'm trying to get nice and cosy for tonight's story, so I thought a warm mug of tea would help. Are you nice and cosy and ready for bed? It's a bit cold in tonight's bedtime story, so I'm glad we're wrapped up warm indoors. This story is by Debi Gliori, and it's called Mr. Bear to the Rescue. It was a wild and windy night in the forest. The kind of night where the best place to be was indoors, snug and warm, with the windows and the doors tightly shut to keep the weather out. Mr. Bear was tucked up in bed listening to the wind howling outside. "Did you hear that?" said Mrs. Bear. "It sounded like someone calling help." "It's just the wind, dear," said Mr. Bear. "Help," said a small voice. "There," said Mrs. Bear. "I did hear someone. Go and see who it is, dear." Mr. Bear went downstairs and opened the front door. "Please, help," said a very small voice from somewhere around Mr. Bear's ankles. And there, clinging onto the doorstep, was Mr. Rabbit Bun. "Our warren has collapsed," he wailed. "The Hoot Tooty's nest is blown away, the Buzz's hive is ruined, and we can't find baby Flora anywhere." And then Mr. Rabbit Bun vanished off into the night. "Help is on its way," said Mr. Bear, grabbing tools and a honey sandwich just in case. "Do be careful, dear," called Mrs. Bear. "Don't worry," said Mr. Bear as he blew down the garden. "I'll be fine." It was a long way to the Rabbit Bun's house. Mr. Bear tripped and stumbled over fallen branches, and several times his lantern nearly blew out. "Ah!" shrieked Mr. Bear as a tangle of feathers and claws blew into his face. "Eek!" squawked Mr. Hoot-to-It. "Oh, it's you!" they both cried in unison. I can't see your house anywhere," said Mr. Bear, peering into the darkness.
"You're standing in it,"
said Mr. Hoot-to-It sadly. And there lay the remains of the tree that the Hoot-to-Its had shared with the Buzzes and the Rabbit Buns. "Oh, Mr. Bear, thank heavens you've come," cried a voice. "Please can you help us find Flora? And can you fix our hive?
"And mend our nest?"
Mr. Bear found himself surrounded by rabbits, owls and bees. "Help," thought Mr. Bear. "What on earth am I supposed to do?" He scrabbled around in his toolkit and found his honey sandwich. A brilliant idea occurred to him. "What's that for?" asked one of the small Rabbit Buns. "Glue," said Mr. Bear, peeling the sandwich apart. Hive glue, in fact. "Look, I'll spread a little here, and another little dot up there." "And end up in a sticky mess," groaned a small Buzz. "Oh dear," said Mr. Bear. "Mrs. Bear will fix that. She's very good at that sort of thing."
"And what about my nest?"
said Mr. Hoot-to-It. "Well, let's see," said Mr. Bear, picking it up. And then the nest fell apart in his paws.
"Oh,"
Mrs. Hoot-to-It sighed. Yes," said Mr. Bear. "Mrs. Bear will knit you another one in no time." The animals put the sticky hive and the broken nest into Mr. Bear's toolkit. Just as the heavens opened, rain poured down through the trees and the animals ran for shelter. Mr. Bear's lantern hissed and then fizzled and then went out. "How will we ever find Flora now?" wailed Mrs. Rabbit Bun. And Mr. Bear anxiously looked up to the sky. "Good grief," he cried. "I found her!" And there, high in the branches of the sheltering tree, was a tiny rabbit, wrapped in a blanket and fast asleep. "I'll just climb up and get her," said Mr. Bear. "What a hero you are!" sighed Mrs. Rabbit Bun. But Mr. Bear did not feel heroic as he inched up the slippery tree which creaked and groaned with every move. At last he disentangled the blanket, cradled Flora in his arms, and "Ah!" yelled Mr. Bear. "Whee!" said Flora, waking up. "Gosh, what a good idea," said Mr. Rabbit Bun, as Flora's blanket fanned out into a perfect parachute, and Mr. Bear and the bunny floated safely down to the ground. "What a brilliant Mr. Bear," said Mrs. Rabbit Bun, hugging Mr. Bear's knees. Mr. Bear relit his lantern and loaded all his friends into his toolkit. "Hold tight," he said. "I'm taking you home." Back through the storm they went till they reached the top of the hill and could see Mr. Bear's house in the distance with the lights on. "Not far now," he said. "We're nearly there." Mrs. Bear had been busy organising beds for everyone, and much later, when a hot nettle soup had warmed every tummy, large and small, the bear house filled with snores. And then Mr. Bear sank into a chair with a groan, and Baby Bear clambered onto his tummy. "What a brilliant Mr. Bear your daddy is," said Mrs. Bear. "So good at fixing things." Mr. Bear gave a huge yawn. "In fact," continued Mrs. Bear, "I have some more things for that daddy to fix. There's the squeaky bathroom door, the blocked sink, and the smoky chimney." Mr. Bear gave a loud snore. "But they can all wait until tomorrow," said Mrs. Bear. "Even brilliant Mr. Bears need a bit of rescuing at times," she said, tucking a blanket round Mr. Bear and the baby and heading upstairs to bed. And that story was called Mr. Bear to the Rescue. I like the idea of army sandwich. Be just right with my mug of tea. In fact, I think I'll just go and find one while you go off to bed. And I'll see you soon for another story. Good night.